Greetings, Model United Nations. I'm Anastasia Shown. I'm the Assistant Director of the African Studies Center here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of your key topics, violence against women. I'm going to kind of overview some of the forms of violence against women, some of the causes and consequences, and then at the end I'll highlight some of the areas that I feel are trends to watch and areas for concern. We know that violence against women can take a physical, mental, and sexual approach, and that the majority of incidents are perpetrated by men against women. There's not one dimensional way to explain violence against women, and we need all healthcare workers, politicians, community leaders, and the international community to know a little bit more about violence against women so that they can all act proactively and offer better care and support. So the first one we're going to talk about is domestic and sexual violence against women. This can lead to the most common type, which is slapping, to the most severe, which is rape, torture, and murder. Rape also involves incest, unwanted pregnancies, and increased STDs. Rape is specifically sensitive because it's largely unreported due to the stigma around it, and it's also largely unpunished. Some statistics about rape: according to the Family Violence Prevention Fund, about 1 in 3 women in the world experiences some form of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse in her lifetime. The World Bank reports that between the ages of 15 and 44, women are more likely to die from rape and domestic abuse than car accidents, malaria, and cancer and war. UNICEF reports that over half the world's population is victimized by domestic violence, and the poorer the nation, the higher the percentage of the population of women are affected by violence. The next section is harmful practices, and virtually every culture in the world has traditions or customs that make some form of violence against women nearly invisible because they are seen as normal or customary. And this can include early marriage. It can include honor killings or honor crimes, which is where a family member can commit abuse or even murder a female family member due to her dishonoring the family. Dowry, which is where a family pays a certain amount of money or a certain amount of land or goods in exchange for a wife. It could also include female genital cutting, female genital mutilation, prenatal sex selection, which is the increased rate of aborting a fetus when you find out that the fetus is a girl. Many of these practices are deemed necessary rituals for women and girls to be maintained in society, and sometimes they're just cultural practices that have to be done to maintain honor and respect in a family or ethnic group or in a community. About every year, 5,000 girls or women are murdered by other family members in the name of honor worldwide. 5,000 worldwide a year. And the UN also shows that around 60 million girls who would have otherwise been alive today are technically missing from society, from various populations, mostly in Asia and South Asia, as a result of sex-selective abortions or the killing of baby girls, infanticide, or neglect. The next section is violence and women's health. Increasingly, violence against women is actually a public health concern. Violence against women can affect a woman's reproductive health and other physical and mental health issues. Sexual violence against women leads to higher rates of infection, STD, HIVs, and sexual assault and rape can leave behind injuries and infections, which make women more susceptible to STDs and HIV. So they have the double burden there. And then again, public announcements of a woman's HIV status or STD status can and then harm her and make her more ostracized from a family and produce more domestic violence or neglect. Another serious health condition is obstetric fistula, and that's when there's a tear or the hole that develops after a woman is trying to give birth, either through like severe childbirth or inability to deliver. And this tear or hole is either between the vagina and the rectum or the bladder and the vagina. And it leads a constant leaking and odor. The women can no longer kind of control those separate organs. And so immediately a woman is usually ostracized from a family. Her husband often leaves her. Family members and other people in the community usually don't want to be around her. She's often not permitted to participate in ceremonies, religious ceremonies, prayer ceremonies, food preparation, because she's considered unclean. So very quickly women develop depression. They can develop it either from the disorder or also from the fact that they might have lost a child in the childbirth, and then in turn they lose their family through this. The procedure costs roughly $300 US, but without the procedure this is a permanent problem that can either oftentimes lead to inability to have a child again. Another violent health concern, we talked about FGM. Female genital mutilation or female cutting is a removal of the clitoris, or all the way to different forms. The most severe form is removal of the clitoris, part of the labia, part of the vagina, and then the vagina is often sewn up with one hole remaining for urination and menstruation. You can see that this would lead to many health problems. Also breast ironing or breast flattening. That is practiced in parts of West Africa where girls in their prepubescent age, their breasts are flattened by different means. They've used hot rocks, they've used material, they've even burned the breasts to try to make the girls look young as long as possible. This keeps them in school, and a lot of mothers and family members believe that this will keep the girls from having sex, or from men wanting to have sex with them. So all these practices are usually practiced by women, either their mothers or their elders or traditional community members that are kind of trained in these practices. A lot of times men don't even know about female cutting or breast ironing. They've never even heard of it. Some statistics about that. In Canada, they try to do a study on the cost of violence against women in terms of their medical infrastructure, and about $1.6 billion a year was cost on medical care and lost productivity from work due to violence against women being injured, having to go to the hospital, missing work because of it. And UNICEF reports that in southern Africa, more girls in the age range from 15 to 19, so teenage girls, are infected with HIV than males of that same age group. So that's showing us, and this is a trend all over the world, that girls are being infected with HIV by men of a much older cohort. And AIDS is now one of the leading causes of death for young women, aged 20 to 40, in a lot of urban cities in Europe, the United States, and sub-Saharan Africa. The next section I want to talk about is trafficking. Trafficking of human persons is a problem that usually has to do with labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. It affects almost all countries in the world, either as a receiver or as an exporter of humans. Men and women are both affected, but women are disproportionately affected because of sex work, and women are targeted because they're disproportionately affected by poverty and discrimination. They're often lured to other countries with promise of work and opportunity, and then they're sold to pimps. And these could be men or women pimps, and they're locked up in rooms or brothels. They're often there for months. They're sometimes drugged, terrorized, and often raped over and over again. Obviously, being in a foreign country, maybe you can't speak the language or you have no family and friends, makes it almost impossible to escape. And women and young girls are not just trafficked for sex work. They could be trafficked for domestic work as well, like childcare, cleaning, other house care work, and they receive little pay or no pay at all. And many times they're not allowed to have contact with the outside world. And Women are not just trafficked internationally. I think when we think of trafficking, we think that it's always across borders. But another big issue is girls that are trafficked from a rural area to urban cities. According to the officials of the Second World Congress Against Commercial Sex Exploitation of Children, sex trafficking is the third most lucrative criminal activity after the smuggling of arms and narcotics. And about 4 million girls are trafficked annually throughout the world. The next section I want to talk about is women in war. Violence against women in conflict areas has reached epidemic proportions. It has not decreased. It has not gone away. With the women's movement and different things, it's actually become a systematic weapon of war. Almost all the major conflicts from the 1990s to now, it's been documented that rape was used as a tactic in war. Women are oftentimes during conflict also forced into economic situations where they have to become prostitutes. So they're struggling for basic necessities throughout war. And the majority of women and children during war are they make up the refugee or the internally displaced population, IDPs. And when they're living in camps, that makes them extra vulnerable to additional attack and abuse because they're oftentimes not with their male family members or not with their old systems where they would protect them. When they're in the camps, they're in a whole new living condition and makes them extra vulnerable to additional attack and abuse. 80% of the refugees in the world today are women and children. And trafficking of women and girls was reported in 85% of the conflict zones. In 2003, of the conflict zones, 85% had women and girls that were trafficked. So part of the problem is the state failing victims, and that's the last kind of a section we're going to talk about, because that's kind of like the double whammy. Violence against women goes largely unreported, and the reasons why are, for fear of other violence, retribution, lack of economic means, emotional dependence, and concern for the children. And few countries have specific training for police, judicial, and medical staff to help address cases like this. Violence against women often goes unnoticed and unpunished. Some states have no laws at all, and others have flawed laws which may punish some forms of violence but not others. Even with appropriate legislation in place, many states fail to implement the law fully. In the USA, 16% of women report rapes to the police. Of those that do not, about 50% said they would if they could be assured that their names and private details would be kept private and not released publicly. Only 16 nations have legislation specifically referring to sexual assault, while as few as 3 have legislation that specifically addresses violence against women as a category of criminal activity. And 79 countries have no or unknown legislation against domestic violence. And those statistics are from Unifem. So let's go into the causes of why this is occurring, what are some of the factors that can show us why this is happening. There's not one single factor, but usually it's a combination of things and interrelated factors that can predict violence in a home, in a family, in a community. Cultural ideologies, both in the industrialized and the developing world, provide legitimacy for these kind of things against women in certain circumstances. Violence against women is rooted in the unequal position of women in society. And research has shown some key things about men that can help us understand. Men view abuse as extreme physical abuse, while women will include shouting, name-calling, threats, coercion, isolation, intimidation, and economic sanctions as abuse. So often men and women see abuse very differently. Men with high self-esteem are less likely to abuse women. Men that are unemployed or making less than women are more likely to become violent. Lack of education and jobs, political ethnic conflict, and general poverty are related to an increased violence against women. Alcohol abuse can be a predictor of violence. And experience during childhood, such as witnessing domestic violence and experiencing some form of physical and mental violence, have been identified as factors that will predict violence in adulthood. There's 4 major sections of life where behaviors are influenced. And I've kind of divided them in a few sections: cultural, economic, legal, and political. So for cultural, gender-specific socialization, expectation of roles within a relationship, belief that males are superior or that males have rights over women, the notion of a family as a private sphere versus a public sphere, marriage customs, and acceptability of violence as a way to resolve conflict. Those are kind of the cultural predictors of violence. Now, economic. When women are economically dependent on men, when they have limited access to cash and credit, and where there's discriminatory laws against women over their inheritance or property rights, such as places where the law is that if a woman's husband dies, the land doesn't go to her, the land would go to her brother. That can be a predictor of violence in the family. Also, limited access to formal and informal sectors and limited access to education and training for women can predict violence. Legal. Laws regarding divorce and child custody and inheritance. Legal definitions in a nation of rape and domestic violence. Low levels of legal literacy among women. And insensitive treatment from police or judiciary members can predict violence. And the last one is political predictors. Underrepresentation of women in the public, political, and media, legal and medical professions. Domestic violence is not taken seriously politically. And the notions of the family being private and beyond the control of the state. And limited organization of women as a political force. Those are the political predictors of domestic violence. So what are some of the main consequences of violence? We all can tell, what it can do to a family, but let's look at the larger system, the larger world community. So basically, violence against women is the denial of a human right. And we know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, and the CEDAW, the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, adopted in 1979, are international treaties that say that the fundamental right of freedom of every human being. Both conventions call for the right to protect people from gender-based abuse and neglect. The strength of these treaties rests on the international consensus and the assumption that the practices that harm women and girls, no matter how deeply rooted in a culture, must be eradicated. These treaties oblige governments not only to protect women from violence, but to investigate when violences occur. Now, that's not always done, but that's what these treaties in the international states that have signed these treaties have agreed to. So that's the first consequence. The second consequence is health consequences. So there's major physical health consequences. There's injuries. These are lacerations, fractures, infections. There's unwanted pregnancy, gynecological problems, STDs, miscarriages, pelvic inflammatory disease, chronic pain, headaches, asthma, self-injurious behaviors such as smoking, drug addiction, frequent unprotected sex. And then we have the mental health consequences: depression, fear, anxiety, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating problems, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And then we have the fatal outcomes: suicide, homicide, maternal mortality, and death from HIV. And the third consequence is the impact on children. Children who've witnessed domestic violence or been violent, had violence perpetrated on them themselves, they exhibit health and behavioral problems, eating disorders, sleeping disorders. It can also result in internalizing violence as a form of conflict resolution. And girls who witness their mother being abused are more likely to think that violence is the norm in a marriage than girls who come from homes that have never seen any kind of abuse. Those that have witnessed violence in their home are more likely to become adults who engage in violent behavior inside the home and outside the home. So the fourth one is, the fourth consequence is the social and economic cost of violence. We have direct costs. So it burdens our medical system, our police system, the criminal justice system, the housing system, and social services. So a lot of money is spent kind of cleaning up the mess from families that have experienced any kind of domestic violence. So then we have non-monetary costs, like the pain and suffering costs. We have increased morbidity, increased mortality via homicide and suicide. We have abuse of alcohol and drugs, and we have depressive disorders. Then we have economic costs, so decreased labor productivity. Women who are being abused are not going to work. We have reduced productivity while at the job, so even while you're at work, if you're going through this, you're not as productive at work. They usually have lower earnings, increased absenteeism, so you don't even show up to work, and intergenerational productivity loss. So women who have gone through this, oftentimes their children are less educated, and so the cycle begins with their children. They have decreased investments in savings and capital flight. Then we have the social costs. So intergenerational reliance, so children and women and the family before all relying on each other puts a burden on the family. They have a reduced quality of life, erosion of social capital. So if you're always having to go to your mother's house for help and always having to borrow money from her, it's going to leave tension within the family. Reduced participation in the democratic process. Women who go through this are less likely to get involved politically or even within the social groups within a society. So some of the areas I see as future trends or conflicts. I won't tell you my solutions for these things. I think that's what you're supposed to come up with. But some areas I see is a kind of a big problem. We do have some good news. The WHO did a big study on domestic violence across the world. One of the biggest studies. It was a little ambitious and it wasn't without flaw, but it did give women a voice and put this on an international platform. And it taught us a lot about collection methods of sensitive topics. But I do see data collection to be a big problem. There are many states that do not collect any data on this. And for a community to recognize it's a problem, sometimes we need those numbers to match it. And the digital divide, communities being connected to phones and the internet and communities that are not, are going to improve their technology of data collection, and it's going to leave other communities in the dust. So we need to kind of bridge that digital divide to give women access to the tools they need to report and collect. States need to be able to collect data on this. One such instance is cell phones. Women have been able to call the police in places where they were never able to call the police. Technologies such as a 911, like an emergency system, is really going to help communities be able to get to women in need and also find out whose needs need and who needs it where and all those kind of things. The next trend I see is war and conflict. We know that this is a problem, but less attention is paid to it than needs to be. Anytime there's instability over power or resources, women are going to be in a vulnerable position. Displacement leads to human trafficking and sex work. So if you have to leave your home and you have no money, nothing else to do, you're going to see increased sex work. Prevention plans need to be in place where conflicts are brewing. One example is the international community's failure to address what's going on in the Congo. The war's been going on for a decade, and yet we hear very little about it in the media. And Congo is considered the rape capital of the world. Immigration. So within war and disaster, you're going to have migration. People are going to move from place to place. And host countries are going to have to learn to value immigrants as their citizens. Oftentimes, immigrants in a new place are less protected than the actual citizens. In terms of violence against women, we're going to have to treat all immigrants as citizens and find a way to protect them. This is very difficult, in Africa when you have a poor country taking care of refugees from another poor country. But it's also been seen to be difficult in Europe. You see increased domestic violence in immigrant communities and European nations kind of unable or having difficulty addressing them and protecting these women. So they need to be sensitive to cultural practices, yes, but they also have to protect the women from abuse. The last trend I see is development work and relief work. This is becoming trendier and trendier. Africa and the developing world is kind of the cool place to go now, and travel is getting easier and easier. As these development projects keep popping up, from the grassroots one to the faith-based ones to the big United Nations ones, we got to make sure that women are part of all development projects. So not just doing focus groups with the women in the village before you put in a water system. You actually need to have women part of the building process, part of the planning process, part of the implementation process. A lot of times you'll see these projects go down, and then once the organization's out, project's over, and it's part of the community, you see the women having to take care of the product, whatever was made or ever was left behind, like business products, agricultural, water projects. You see this all the time, and then women are the ones, they don't have the tools to sustain the project. And I'm thinking specifically of a project that we did in Cameroon where we made a water committee, and the water committee was trained on how to fix the water system that was just installed if there is a future problem. Well, the water committee didn't have one woman on it. And you think if there's a problem with the pipes or a problem with the well, a woman's probably going to be the first to notice. She's the one going to get the water. Her kids are the one going to get the water. And yet she's not part of the water committee that's trained on how to fix that. That's a big error. So women need to be part of that process on all those development projects, health projects, business projects, and so on. You also need women in positions of power. So the people going in to do these projects, you need to see women engineers, you need to see women social workers, women health professionals working on the projects, either people from the community or even people from the outside. So anytime there's kind of like a quota for employment for women, I think that helps these projects. That's about it. I hope I've given you enough information where you can kind of tackle these problems for your nation, and you can see if some of the things I talked about are more common in your communities. But you should know that this is a thing all over the world. Any economic background, ethnic background, violence against women touches everybody, men, women, and children. So I thank you for your participation. Good luck on your decision making, and good luck in your continued work as a global citizen.